Hello, my name is Marie Elting, and I serve as the Program Manager for the Sitka Center for Art and Ecology. It is a joy to welcome you to tonight's resident talk. Sitka is located at Cascade Head on the north-central Oregon coast and resides on the unceded traditional lands of the Indigenous people now represented by the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. There is much to learn. Just one step we can take, especially when planning a visit to Sitka or the coast, is to visit the Grand Ronde Chichala Museum and Cultural Center. And it is now my pleasure to introduce the first of tonight's residents, Epiphany Couch. Raised in Tacoma, Washington, and based in Portland, Oregon, Epiphany Couch is an interdisciplinary artist and writer, Puyallup, Yakima, and Scandinavian descent. Her work explores generational knowledge, storytelling, and our relationship with the natural and spiritual worlds, working across photography, beadwork, weaving, and collage. She reinterprets traditional forms to create images, installations, and sculptural works that engage ancestral knowledge and invite new ways of understanding. Her practice is rooted in unconventional collaborations across time, between generations, and with the natural world, and recognizes these relationships as vital to sustaining memory, culture, and identity. Welcome to Sitka, Epiphany.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to see everyone. Well, some of you I get to see, some of you just exist in my mind's eye. Thank you, Maria, for that wonderful introduction. I just wanted to start off by saying thank you for joining and hearing a little bit about my practice and then what I've been up to here. So as Maria mentioned, I'm an interdisciplinary artist, which means in a nutshell, I do kind of whatever I want that feels right for the work. I love the outdoors. I love spending time with the natural world. My work is very rooted in generational knowledge and storytelling, and I use a variety of mediums. So I thought I'd start out with just some of my inspirations that show up a lot in my work. I love archives. This is a visit that I did last year to the Burke Museum. They have an incredible collection of both Puyallup and Yakima baskets, and I am a weaver. That's kind of what I'm working on here at Sitka, so I'll share more about that a little bit later on. But this is a Puyallup basket and a Puyallup mat. This is some Yakima basketry, some plateau basketry, and I really, really love the patterns in a lot of our weaving, both kind of our wool weaving and our basket weaving. And so you'll see these patterns come up in my work. The outdoors also is a huge inspiration for me. Spend a lot of time outdoors. My dad was a mountaineer while I was growing up. My mother, early in her college career, studied geology. And so we spent a lot of time outdoors, kind of really learning about the natural world, both physically and spiritually. This is my brother-in-law on a huckleberry trip. I also am very inspired by the gifts that nature provides us: huckleberry, sweetgrass, cedar, which I'll talk about a lot more later on. My ancestors are also a huge inspiration to me and my work, and they also show up very frequently in my work. So I kind of want to cruise through just some images of my work over the past couple of years. I do love collage. It's kind of a beautiful metaphor for taking a bunch of ideas or thoughts or visuals and then, kind of learning from them and putting them into one kind of presence. I'm also a writer, and so poetry shows up in my work a lot. Archival images, and then my own images as a photographer. There's a little close-up. That's my grandma right there. Here's some more. This is a series based on the story of Huckleberry Sister and Chokecherry Sister, which is a Yakima story that I grew up with. The arrangement of things is very inherent in my work. I love to, have kind of these pretty simple compositions, sometimes some busy compositions, but in this particular series, I really wanted kind of the presence of our ancestors who, used to be there physically, but they still remain. And so what does that look like? How can I represent the ways in which they do live on with us? This is some of my beadwork. This is the Homa, which is our mountain, Mount Rainier up in Washington, where I'm from. Another aspect of my work is public artwork. Really some of the same visual language, but just on a kind of bigger, more durable scale. You start to see some of the patterns from the basketry show up. These are actually made up of images that I took in the places that this work is installed. The center images are double exposure images. I love double exposure. It is kind of a way for me to collaborate with nature. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, it's, two images in one, right? So I take an image on my camera, and then before I advance the film, I take another image right on that same piece of film. So it kind of is, I never know what I'm going to get, and sometimes it's quite exciting. This one I chose to include because this was actually taken a couple years ago on Nesquin Beach here near Sitka. Archives also make their way into my work a lot, archival images. The house here is my ancestors' house on the Puyallup Reservation. I was able to find 2 images of it, and it's just very special to have those images. This is an image of my great-grandfather and my great-aunt, and this is from a recent series that I showed in Portland, just kind of digging into what patriotism means to Native people, to my family specifically. With a lot of military service in my Yakima side. And so this series, the Draft Star series, each point in the star is actually made up of a recreation of a draft card for one of my ancestors. I also love to use found object in my work, the metaphor for something that's been cast aside, and the metaphor for what our country tends to do to people has kind of made its way into my work more and more, thinking about Native people, immigrants, houseless people. So this series of work was kind of about reclaiming that and welcoming people in. Hadeo means come in Tulshutsi, which is my ancestral language of the Puyallup tribe that I've been learning. So this kind of leads us to weaving. I've always loved weaving. Again, a rich metaphor for kind of how to bring things together. This is a hat based on the shape of a cedar hat, but it's made of images and text. So this is a hat that I made last year for my nephew Taylor, and this was my second cedar hat. They're pretty time-consuming to make, and so when I was thinking about what I could do here at Sitka, I thought, I would love it to have a month just to weave, just to be present and weave. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with cedar is a material that the Puyallup tribe and the Yakima tribe have used, for many generations, for many purposes, from, clothes to hats. And so I go every year with my tribe, with my family and my tribe. And so we'll strip the cedar. We'll ask permission from the tree. If you've never been shown how, don't do it. You need to be shown how. And then we'll sit and we'll process the cedar there. And by process, I mean we remove the outer bark from the inner bark. And it's a really special time to sit there in the woods with my community, and we talk and we, enjoy our time out there. And then this is what you have left, this cedar, and it cures for 1 year, and then you can use it in that second year to weave with. So I made a little video. I heard a phrase recently that I love. Oh, and this was shot at Sitka. So, tradish-ish. This idea that we can honor our traditional ways of being, while also acknowledging that we live in a world very different from that of our ancestors. These past few weeks at Sitka, I've been honoring the slowness, the stillness of splitting cedar outdoors. Sitting by the creek, listening to the water, listening for the ancestors. Then I'll take the cedar back to my studio and weave a hat on a 3D printed hat mold, because I'm tradish-ish. I want to show you all of the process photos, but I also want to be mindful of time, so I'm going to go kind of quickly. But here's, a bunch of the processed cedar. Here's the weaving in the center for the top of the hat. You see the hat mold kind of placed on the other weaving to see how big it needs to be. And then this is what the hat actually looks like as it comes together as I'm weaving. Doing some edge work. There's the hat all finished up. She's also back here. I'm on my table here. And then we had some lovely time in the studio where some of the cohort came and we processed cedar together and wove together and learned together. And it was really, really special. And I'm just so very grateful for our time here together and for this place that helped me make this hat. Hawadop's Chilob. Thank you.
Thank you, Epiphany. What a treat to see a cedar weaving workshop happening during residency season and not just workshop season at Sitka.
Yeah.
Um, Thanks for sharing and presenting. I'm so glad you and Eddie had a wonderful time. Our next presenter is Fiona Glenn. Fiona Glenn is a writer and artist from Edinburgh who is currently based in Vancouver, BC. Her work explores how we live with and within each other as part of a shared biosphere. Glenn's poetry and prose have been published in journals and presses, including Art Review, HarperCollins, and Dorling Kinzardly. Together with Nina Hans, Glenn wrote an experimental collection of poetry called Mycoglossia, which gives rise to many fungal and mycelial voices. Mycoglossia has been performed in different formats in 4 countries and is being recorded as part of a forthcoming album with Modern Biology, a musician who modulates the bioelectricity of mushrooms and plants into music. Welcome back to Sitka, Fiona.
Thank you so much, Maria. So yeah, I'm joining from Vancouver. I came in December for 3 weeks. So while I didn't get the chance to meet this lovely cohort, I have had some time to sort of absorb and feel the gifts of the residency and how they kind of are continuing to act on me, which has been really interesting. I applied to Sitka knowing that I wanted to start writing a big poetry project around sound, listening, and bioacoustics. But at that point, it was very much just a desire and a sort of an energy towards something. But through 2025, I've been gathering research and ideas. And by the time I got to Sitka, I had just this desire to get everything out, to kind of spread it out and see what the connections were between things, to see what really magnetized me in this curiosity, and to see like what the question would be that will drive the work over the years to come. But in sort of thinking about listening, it was also a really special opportunity, as any time at Sitka probably is, to just be in the environments that are near there and to just be listening with all my senses and absorbing and being present. And to be sensing the changes in the environment, which there were a huge amount of in December. It was a very changeable month with like some of the most glorious days and then also some really intense storms. We had about 3 major storms and power cuts within a week at one point, and that kind of tempestuousness and feeling the sort of the seasons being riled up was really interesting, and to be listening to that as well. And yeah, I think for me, the implicit invitation in the residency itself to be attentive to place and for that to almost be my job was really, really precious and a really special opportunity to kind of slow down and to really come into a more intentional kind of attention to a place which is so brimming with plant and animal and fungal life. So that presencing work partly felt important to me because when thinking about and researching sound, I think it kind of pulls us naturally towards thinking about time and about presence. And there's a quote that I think captures this really beautifully. To engage in the erotics of place means to engage in time. And this is a quote from Terry Tempest Williams, but it's something that I came across in my time at Sitka in reading one of the books from the library, in which this kind of poet, sound artist, Stephen Peters, spent, I think, multiple years returning to the same site, recording hours and hours of I was going to say music there, but of environmental sound, which he then kind of transformed into artworks of different kinds. And while I will not in any way insinuate that my time of 3 weeks at Sitka was that durational, just a little sense of like what happens when for a duration we give that attention to place, how that can deepen felt really important to me. And yeah, kind of reminded me that I am trying to, in my practice, do some of that slowing down, more active engaging with time, which can also be engaging differently with others. I had a sort of regular walk, which I'm sure many residents do, up Cascade Head. It's such a fantastic hill mountain right beside the center. And I had sort of key listening spots that became really important to my process. And one of these was a sort of a bridge, which I thought of as a listening bridge because it runs over a creek as a bridge does. It kind of the experience of standing there or stopping there would be really different depending on the weathers that had happened recently and the time of day and which life forms were doing what at that time. And it could also function as a kind of standing desk. So that was interesting. But because I was thinking about sound a lot in my research while I was at Sitka, I also noticed the sort of subconscious way that sound influenced how I felt I could move through the landscape. So I realized that I knew where I was on the route by the different sounds that my boots made on different bridges. So that kind of would tell me how far along the route I was. And that kind of noticing was really fun and kind of allowed by having this cyclical return to the same walk. I also had a listening spot kind of nested in the trees near a cliff, fairly close to the top of Cascade Head, which was secluded and allowed me to sit and listen in various different weathers and kind of just be a little bit private there and be able to write or draw or just think. And that interacted with the other side of writing, which is not photogenic and which I think also should be seen for what it is, which is sometimes very messy and at a desk in the dark. But what was really wonderful about the residency experience at Sitka is that it gave me a chance to trial a much more balanced way of working where moving and being active and being engaged in a landscape was then interrelated with time spent at a desk in this kind of abstract way of thinking, and ideas would connect between them in a way that felt really rich. But yeah, the sort of beyond the practice of like what I was doing, I was diving into a huge amount of research while at Sitka. I'd had time to sort of generate quite a lot of points of interest already, but I was going down sort of internet rabbit holes and looking at documentaries and gathering new points of research as well. And just kind of allowing all of the different things that I was drawn to kind of come out and seeing them all and seeing connections that I wouldn't have necessarily immediately made between very, very different types of materials or very, very different types of media that I want to write about going forwards or that I've started writing about. And having that headspace and that time to do so was really, I don't think I've had that much headspace for a project ever. So having that within a contained period where it could be sort of my living and working space was really beautiful. And yeah, I didn't try to sort of complete writing. I tried to just kind of make the starts of different things and map out possibilities for what the segments of a project might be. And also having that headspace allowed me to return to some of the very initial entry points that I had into this interest in acoustic ecology, which one of those is Bernie Krause, who's like a very prominent recordist and theorist on acoustic ecology. And he's got this foundational paper called the Acoustic Niche Hypothesis. And when I came back to it, I found this quote towards the end, which is that each area generates its own unique voice print. The acoustical fabric into which a bird's song is woven offers up an elixir of formidable intelligence that enlightens us about ourselves, our past, and the very creatures we have longed so earnestly to know. And yeah, when I kind of saw that quote, it was really beautiful to see how there was there were themes like intimacy and intelligence and this kind of deep human curiosity to attempt to understand beings that we will never fully understand, and this kind of interdependency and commonality that we have with radically different beings that I've been drawn to in my research and initial writing about sound, and then to see them sort of captured in this foundational text with, yeah, this foundational place that I started was really wonderful. And my magnum opus during my time at Sitka was this crazy mind map, which I had the pleasure of making because I had a big cork board and I was like, I like that. I'm going to use that big cork board and kind of make it the center point of my space, which was really wonderful. And I kind of see this like I've made a sort of galaxy that's not a plan and it's not a map for where I'm going with the project, but it's something that I can kind of gaze into and remind myself of what what excites me, what sparks me in this project, and can help me when I'm writing poetry going forward to kind of connect things that aren't immediately obvious or that kind of really excite me. The question that I kind of got to during my time at Sitka that I think will drive the project over years to come is how can our common experience of being resonated bodies bring us to a deeper and more intimately felt understanding of our kinship with the rest of the living world and allow us to feel the changes and the wounds that are being inflicted on it in a way that is more personal and owned by us. And there's another lovely quote from Pauline Oliveros that I think speaks to this really beautifully. It's actually two quotes that I've put together because I love them both. But it is that our world is a complex matrix of vibrating energy, matter, and air, just as we are made of vibrations. Vibration connects us with all beings and connects us to all things interdependently. the skin listens to. And I just, after talking about my project so much and it feeling very solo, I just wanted to acknowledge my wonderful cohort who was there during my residency. I think the experience of connecting with them and of learning something from each of them, even though they weren't trying to teach, it was just being learned from their way of being and making, massively expanded and shaped my time at Sitka. So yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that kind of the life affirmingness of being in community with people and connecting in quite little time, and yeah, how beautiful that was. And while I'm doing quick shout outs at the end, I also wanted to acknowledge the amphibians. I had a lot of salamander and newt encounters at Sitka. I told cohort mates that I had, as a high school student, I was like, oh, I'm interested in all of these arts areas, but I would like to be a herpetologist and I would like to be a biologist as well. And I was almost toying with it. I was like, oh, should I become a biologist? And then the salamanders kept showing up and the newts kept showing up like on my doorstep and on my runs and in my window frames. And it was just a really sort of numinous and precious thing to be reminded of how much they delighted me. And I just wanted to say that I have signed up for a course it's called the Master Herpetologist, and it's a sort of, well, open to anyone citizen scientist sort of course in herpetology. So residencies in nature for artists get us doing ecology, maybe it'll be my gateway into herpites again. Yeah, just as a final thing, I think the most important thing that I've realized happened for me during the residency, beyond what was wonderful with reconnecting with those creatures and with the project specifically, was kind of coming back to myself and my creative practice. And that was something that I felt on leaving. I felt suddenly so much more sure and rerouted and weightier in a good way, like reestablished in my certainty and my kind of fire. Because, yeah, I think I've been a bit in the wilderness for a couple of years, kind of in an awkward teenage phase of making some changes in my creative practice, but having some angst and doubt about that. And it just has re-sparked me on my other projects as well. And I can feel that it's kind of acting on me and it's something I can return to as an anchor point of being like, no, I know how good that felt. So I just wanted to acknowledge that gift as well and say thank you for that kind of restorative and generative thing that I think will go beyond the project that I was working on. So thank you. Here are some elk on Cascade Head that are very small.
Thank you, Fiona, for sharing your newts and your mind maps with us tonight. It can be so special to hear from someone who's several weeks out from their residency and how it's now landing for them. Next up is Takahiro Suzuki. Takahiro Suzuki is a Maine-based artist and educator. He completed his BA in studio art from the University of Virginia and received his MFA in film, video, animation, and new genres from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His work and research practices as an artist serve as a form of inquiry, where the end product is not so much a thesis upon which to land, but an open hypothesis for the audience to consider. His works have been exhibited and screened nationally and internationally. Suzuki is currently an assistant professor of art at Colby College and also serves as the co-founder and co-curator of A Cinema, a collaboration with Janelle van der Kleen, which presents experimental film and video screenings at Woodland Pattern in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Sitka community, please join me in giving Takahiro a warm welcome.
Thanks, Maria. So I just wanted to start by saying thank you to everyone at Sitka and then also my cohort who I was in residence with for 2 weeks at Sitka. It was really great to meet everyone there and spend the 2 weeks out in coastal Oregon. So I'll start by saying, similar to Epiphany, I'm also an interdisciplinary artist, but I primarily work in experimental film and video and also a little bit in photography. Recently, and with a lot of my recent works, what I've been thinking about is the idea of non-human forms of intelligence, and particularly a few of my recent films, plant intelligence, which I know is a little bit of a divisive term in the scientific community, but thinking about different ways in which we can think about the ways in which plants communicate or how plants are able to thrive in a larger ecosystem and how that's possible. And if we as humans were able to tap into that, what might that look like? Or what might that sound like or feel like? My recent work has also been rooted in literature, drawing inspiration from like-minded artists, environmentalists, ecologists that have done research in that field or are thinking about the living world in a similar way. Some of the examples are in James Bridle's Ways of Being. There's an anecdote or an essay about the formation of the subway system in Tokyo and how the subway system was actually molded or yeah, I guess I'll say molded through slime molds, because slime molds are really efficient at finding food sources. So they would leave the food sources on like a petri dish with locations of the major cities in Japan, and then put a slime mold culture in there. And then whatever the slime mold created in terms of its mapping for finding the food source, that is actually what the Tokyo subway system is laid out in. So things like that, or in The Language of Trees, the Irish artist Katie Holton invited essays from a wide range of people to write about trees, but in the book you have the written English, but also she as an artist created the English alphabet with different illustrations of trees. So next to the essays you also have the sort of illustrated pictorial representation of the text through trees. So thinking about that and thinking about ways in which we can think about the sort of like expanded ecology is sort of what I've been calling it, is thinking about ways in which we can move beyond our human-centric form of understanding the landscape and try to build this more empathetic relationship of understanding with or from the perspective of another being, is what my recent work has been rooted in. A few examples: this was a recent short film that I made, which is called Electric Moonlight and the Language Within the Leaves. This one is actually a retelling of a Japanese folktale, The Bamboo Cutter and the Moon Princess. In that folktale, there is a bamboo cutter who cuts down a bamboo tree, finds a newborn child inside it, and then he and his wife raise that child, who ends up being the Moon Princess. And there are a lot of suitors that try to win the heart of the Moon Princess, but she eventually reveals herself as the Moon Princess and returns home. In this modern retelling, I told the story with the Moon Princess as the protagonist, and in order to return home to the moon, turns to the trees, listens to the untapped observational knowledge of the trees, and then returns home that way. This film is called Inverted Valleys, which I completed most recently. And when we think about the sort of expanded ecology, or thinking about non-human forms of intelligence, I think now in our current state, we can't ignore artificial intelligence in the way that we anthropomorphize this technological entity as sort of this living creature that exists among us. So in Inverted Valleys, I think about artificial intelligence as sort of an extension of the human, and thinking about how the impact of artificial intelligence can be really similar to colonial histories, because of the ways in which we think about water usage from artificial intelligence, the way that data centers are impacting mostly marginalized communities, or are built around not city centers, but on the outskirts, and thinking about how potentially this technology is also repeating cycles of human history, and how we can possibly create a more sympathetic or symbiotic relationship with technology. That sort of leads me to the work that I went about doing at Sitka. Since I was only there for 2 weeks, a lot of what I did at Sitka was material gathering for me to produce new work now that I'm back home in Maine. This is one of the artworks that inspired me for a project, which is the conceptual artist Josephine Shetty and his work 1 in 3 Chairs. So it's a photograph of a chair, the chair itself, and a dictionary definition of the chair. Part of what I was doing at Sitka was gathering objects, thinking about the 3 different ways now that we can interact with wildlife or with the environment. Similar to 1 in 3 Chairs, I was thinking about the human interpretation and representation or emotion attached to these living beings or objects from the natural world. So that is something that I didn't have time to do at Sitka, but it would be me creating these sort of abstract works with oil pastels on paper. So it would be representations of and emotions felt from the landscape or from these objects. The second iteration would be either the object itself or the closest thing to it, which would be a photographic representation of it. And then the third would be and similar to technology as this sort of living being capable of seeing, it would be a digital version of the object. So on the right, you see a 3D scan of the wooden piece in the two left images. And then the other way in which machines can see is through actual live scanning itself. I also want to shout out fellow resident Megita Denton, who turned me on to Scanning First, which is a sort of 3D mapping app for the phone. The actual end product from this app is like similar to what you see in Google Maps when you drop the little orange dude on the map and you get to spin around and see the landscape. But for me, I was really much more interested in the capturing process where the machine was trying to interpret and interpolate the landscape itself. So I did screen recordings on the phone. I really like this sort of gathering process and thinking about how machines see or interpret the landscape. I think whether it ends up in this work or in a later film and thinking about how to utilize this. And then the second thing that I worked on at Sitka was thinking about a new potential like story or film to be told, and mostly told through instant film images. For those that aren't familiar, there is this film called La Jetée, or The Jetty, by Chris Marker, and it's mostly told through still images, and it's this sort of post-apocalyptic film where this individual time travels and eventually like tries to see and re-encounter this woman that he meets, and it starts and ends with this scene where he essentially is witnessing his own death through all this time travel, but it's mostly told through still images. And if you've also seen the film 12 Monkeys, that is a feature-length retelling of this short. And then another filmmaker that I was thinking about is the Russian filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky, and particularly his film Solaris, where there's a body of water and fog, and it's this idea that this body of water also holds memories, particularly memories that we as humans repress. And through this interstellar base and flying over this body of water, humans are subjected to those repressed memories or visions that we don't necessarily want to encounter through that body of water. And he also famously took a lot of Polaroid. I apologize for the poor quality of these. I wasn't able to scan them before, so these are just quick snapshots taken on my phone. And that way I was thinking about how I could tell this story from the perspective of a machine after humans have disappeared and all that's left are trees, the land, and wildlife. So it would really start with the land and then thinking about how things slowly start to disappear, how mushrooms, or these beings of decomposition, started to become more frequent in the landscape. And then this is also something that's really nice, also harkens back to the way that technology sees things, is with instant film, one of the shortcomings is it's really prone to overexposure and solarization. So if you have the sun directly in the frame, it actually inverts the sun and turns it into this black dot. With this story told through still photos, I was thinking about how that could be the turning point, or the thinking of knowing that the world was about to end was witnessing the sun sort of give up on Earth and become this black dot, similar to Tarkovsky and Solaris. Because one of the great things about Sitka and being in coastal Oregon is every day or every other day you'd have the fog roll in. So I like this idea of the world eventually becoming encompassed or engulfed by mist. And then I would go every day pretty much and drive down to Dee River Beach in Lincoln City and just watch the sunset. And there was one day where the entire beach just got engulfed by fog and you really couldn't see anything. So this is the last image that I have. And it's essentially thinking about this being the last image of the world, or this seeing how the world ends. And I don't want to end on a downer, so I'll just end on this image, which again is another thank you to Sitka for the time there and all the beautiful landscapes and views that you have there. And also thank you to my cohort that I spent that 2 weeks with.
Thank you so much, Takahiro. What a fascinating exploration of technology and ecology. Next, we have Josephine Shetty. Josephine Shetty is an experimental pop artist and vocalist, best known by the monikers Kohinoorgasm and Girl DeBoard, and as the lead singer of electro-pop duo Pride Month Barbie. Shetty is known for combining susurrate vocals and extended vocal techniques with a minimal and hypnotic production style, while integrating vast influences from the Cocteau Twins to Diamanda Gallis to Sheila Chandra. Since releasing her debut solo album, Titali, in 2017, Shetty has performed at South by Southwest, the Echo, UCLA, Berkeley Art Museum, Sarah Lawrence College, the Great American Music Hall, and most notably within California's underground music scene. Josephine is born and raised in Los Angeles, and she teaches at California Institute of the Arts. Josephine, over to you.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you everyone who's just here and for listening to us and supporting our art in the ways that you do as an arts community. I'm Josephine. By the way, Fiona, I think we're in the same house, and I loved hearing about your practice because in ways mine is similar, and it just feels really like blessed to know that you were here before me doing similar work. So, like Maria mentioned, I am primarily a vocalist and I've lended my voice in a lot of different ways to different projects, starting with my solo project, Kohinorgasm, which was kind of like my entry point into like writing and sharing my own music. I started that in my very early 20s and got to connect with a lot of people around the world through that music. And I continue to release and perform music as Kohinorgasm, but I've also started some other projects since then, like my band Pride Month Barbie and my newer solo project Girl to Board, for which I kind of came here to explore the sound of. So that new project, I relate to what some other residents were saying about being in like a transitional period in your practice where you're trying new things and maybe exploring like bigger concepts than you have before in your art. My new project, Girl to Board, which I'll play a couple songs from in a second, is something that I came here to explore. And I will say, I think first and foremost, it's just nice to have like a space where I can sing really loud and make a lot of noise. And because of the amazing Oregon insulation, I'm not disturbing anyone, hopefully, with that. So here's a little picture of my setup, which is just, I'm just so grateful for every moment of the experience here because it's so beautiful. Every little thing from where I'm working at my desk to the trails I'm exploring is so gorgeous. And I'm really grateful for the chance to just be out here and spend time in nature, but to also make music with that energy in mind. So here's my little workstation in my house. I brought my speakers and my synth. And this, I should have put a better picture of it, but this little box right here is my sampler. And another thing that I wanted to do while I was here was just learn how to use this every day. It's a new piece of gear I got to support my performance practice. And I bought it last year and never really used it. And so I brought it here with the goal that I would sit down every day and learn how to use it. And I totally have. It's a great device for uploading samples that you've either designed yourself or downloaded from the internet or even taken through field recordings. Field recording has been an activity that I've done every week here in different ways. Here's a picture of me sampling some saw sounds in the sculpture studio. But I also took my field recorder out with us crabbing and through the forest and on my walk. So I have lots of other great local field recordings. And I have just been working on music. So songwriting, integrating these instruments and sounds into my music. So I thought I would just spend some time sharing some songs with you all. I'll just play like a minute or so of each track. These two songs right here, I wrote while I was here, among a lot of others. It's been so great to have the time. These are just two of the songs I've written while I was here. And then this is a song that I wrote before I got here, but I've been working on translating the sounds to my sampler so that I can play it live while I sing more easily. So I'll start with, I'm going to fade it in like a true nerd. So, as you can imagine, singing some of those notes in my crowded apartment in Los Angeles is not always easy or comfortable for maybe me or my neighbors. So, I'm really grateful. I've been like totally singing to this huge window in front of me, and I feel like Cinderella. Thank you for listening. And one thing I wanted to mention is that I do have these tapes with me. Oh, they're too reflective. Oh, here we go. I have some tapes. I duplicated all of them myself. I mixed, mastered, recorded, sang everything. And I have a few available at Spec Records in Portland. It's on Vermont near Kenton Park. It's a cute record store, and they were really down to support just like a traveling artist. So if you're interested, they're over there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josephine. So excited to be welcoming you back this summer in July as a visiting instructor for our Kate Crate Summer Program. Our final speaker for this evening is Kirk Gordon. Kirk Gordon is a landscape architect and nonfiction writer based in Brooklyn, New York. His work investigates the role of nature in our rapidly urbanizing, digitizing world and explores new practices and perspectives that reimagine our relationship with nature for the 21st century. He is currently employed at Scape Landscape Architecture in New York City, a firm specializing in design of resilient, ecologically driven public parks and open spaces, where he focuses on climate adaptive planting and maintenance practices. He is also the author of Unnatural Heritage, a Substack newsletter exploring the strange entanglements between the natural and digital worlds. His work has been featured in publications such as The Other Almanac and the Substack Post. Welcome, Kirk.
Thanks, Maria. And thanks everyone at Sitka for such amazing opportunity to come here. And also to my cohort, as you can tell, they are an extremely talented crew. And it's been so nice to just speak with all of them about their work. So as Maria said, I'm a landscape architect as well as a writer. And so my work really extends across a bunch of different types of modalities. You know, at work as a landscape architect, I'm doing environmental analysis, land use design and planting design. I also think more speculatively in my free time about other types of designs. thinking about graphic communications and explaining ecological concepts to the public in that way. And then, as I said before, I'm also a nonfiction writer. But I think, all of these things are kind of under a single umbrella, which is I just really love telling stories through the land. I think landscapes are an extremely powerful narrative device, one that's very grounding, especially now as we're kind of shifting into a digital world. I think about that a lot in all of my work. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of my projects as a landscape architect. And so this was a project at a nature center in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So whenever we get to a new site, we're always thinking about just kind of grounding and understanding the different histories and stories within that new location. And so in this project, we were just trying to tease out the geological history of the site and the ecological histories of the site. It's an extremely diverse site. It has over 7 different types of ecosystems in a very small area. And so this was just kind of visualizing why this place is so biodiverse, looking at the flyways, looking at the histories of disturbance and agriculture on site, and how those relate to pockets of invasive species and all these kinds of things. And so these graphics were eventually used in the curriculum at the Nature Center. But as a landscape architect, we're always translating those findings into design. And so we're also able to design this brand new trail system for the park, where each loop is kind of has its own mini curriculum, a thematic curriculum. So we came up with like a loop about geology, a loop about the floodplain and hydrology, a loop about the cultural history of the Civil War and of the indigenous presence on site, this kind of living curriculum that exists out in the landscape. I also just really love plants. My background is in plant biology and zoology, so I do have that science background, and so that kind of guides a lot of my work, even though I've shifted into a kind of design and creative field. But I just wanted to share this project because it's a project that's really meaningful to me, and it was this big biodiversity survey in a neighborhood in Manhattan called Battery Park City. If you don't know Battery Park City, it's this strange little neighborhood that exists like out in the middle of the Hudson, basically. You can kind of see it in that image to the left. When they were building the original Twin Towers, they took everything that they excavated from the foundation and then they just kind of dumped it in the river and they made an entirely new neighborhood. So this neighborhood like came out of the water in like the 70s. And now it's this amazing network of all these wonderful parks and things. But like all places that you kind of forge within the water always wants to come back. And so these are some images from Hurricane Sandy in 2012, where there was really some kind of devastating flooding. And, of course, this reclaimed land was hit the hardest because it used to be part of the river. And so there's this big project in Lower Manhattan now. It's called the Lower Manhattan Coastal Resiliency Project. It's essentially they're putting in a huge flood wall all around the lower part of Manhattan. And you can see to the left here, I'm sort of standing next to this light pole, and the light blue at the top there, that's the projected flood levels for 2050, which of course we are rapidly approaching. It's a very kind of timely project. It's a very controversial project, obviously, because it's creating a lot of disturbance for these existing neighborhoods and for the existing park spaces. And so my firm is working to redesign the park spaces around the new flood wall once it's finally installed. At work, I often am in charge of the planting design. And so as we began to think about how we were going to plant this new project, I first wanted to get a sense of just like basically who's already here. We did this huge biodiversity baseline study throughout this whole neighborhood, came up with a very specific way of understanding the different plants that are there, logging them all, understanding their characteristics to understand what we're probably losing with this disturbance, but also how we can kind of plant better in a more resilient way for the future and climate change and all the risks that would kind of create. So these are just some images of some of the great plants that we saw out there. There's a lot of biodiversity in this neighborhood. And then from those takeaways, we were able to really refine our planting palette, push towards more natives, and specifically to rely really heavily on our native coastal communities out in New York. When they were first planting all of these parks, they weren't thinking about flooding, and that's why there was so much kind of damage to the landscapes. And so we're planting a lot of plants that we know will be really resilient to these future floods and can handle salt water and all these kinds of things. So that's kind of like my landscape architecture day job. I love plants in the free time too. And so this is my own garden in my backyard. I also just like had to share this with you guys. It's like my baby. I've been working on it for 4 or 5 years now. I'm just trying to create pollinator habitat back there. Last year I hit my 100th native species, which is this delphinium up in the top right, which really doesn't look like much, but is like so precious to me. And so, I'm very interested in the native plants on the East Coast. And so it's been really, really cool to come out here. I've really spent almost no time in the Pacific Northwest. And so all I can say is you guys are so lucky. Like, it's so cool out here. The nature is so big and it's so powerful. It's completely different from the East Coast, and it's just been a total joy to like learn this landscape. I do these little things called pixel palettes, which is like collecting different things and then trying to understand the colors within them, you know. And so these are just some from my hikes around Sitka. And it's so funny, you know, like it's essentially all my favorite plants, like favorite cousins. You know, the Rockies sort of has this evolutionary split. And so there's all of these cousins of the plants that I love out here who are just like slightly different and slightly larger, slightly weirder. And so that's been so fun. This is just another project. This is more of like a graphic communication project, more from kind of like a public facing project. But I made this little zine called Designing with Dormancy, which is basically about how we think about our gardens in the winter. So how we understand plant dormancy and the kind of pressures that and stressors that winter creates for plants, their physiological changes in the winter, but then how we design a really beautiful garden in the winter as well as manage for gardens so that they, you know, they can be the best habitat for all those kind of sleeping insects. Obviously, the winters in New York are like a little bit more intense than the winters in Oregon. I've loved being here in January because it's been like sunny a lot and 50 degrees. And as you may have heard, there's like a huge snow dump in New York right now. And I'm just kind of like, ha ha ha, like just having a great time. So those seasonal changes has been really interesting too. My real focus at Sitka is actually my writing. So this is something, you know, that I'm squeezing into my nights and my weekends, but I've been really trying to push for. And so I have this Substack newsletter called Unnatural Heritage, and it essentially just explores like the weird entanglements between the natural and the digital world. You know, especially as I think the digital world is starting to feel more and more kind of intoxicating. It's taking more and more of our attention, perhaps at the detriment of our relationship with the natural world. And so I'm just kind of trying to intervene, both to show that digital technologies are like these earthly things. They're made of rocks and they're grounded in landscapes, but also that, you know, natural logics have a lot to say about how we think about the future of our digital systems. So these are just like a couple things I've written about. This is one I really enjoyed writing. It was about the history of Y2K product design. You may be like remember the iMac and this kind of like clear craze that went through Y2K product design. And that was actually born out of prison design. And so they all the devices that were going to prison had to be clear because they were afraid that people were smuggling weapons into them. And so this is really interesting history, and I'm just very interested in how that relates now to our own experience of kind of surveillance and transparency in technology right now. It's very opaque now, and what that feels like in the body. That piece was sort of about that. This was a more kind of like fun piece, a speculative piece. It was like a movie review of The Wild Robot, if anyone has seen that. And then kind of like a speculative imagining if all these AI systems that we're kind of using in conservation, like iNaturalist and Merlin, if they kind of like lead the AI revolution and everyone just sort of like runs away into the forest and they start communicating with the earth and they sort of reject humans, what that kind of world might be, and is a really fun one to write. I've also done some things that are not necessarily about digital technology. This is about the history of military camouflage and its kind of origin in the natural sciences, and then also how it's informed the art world. And so this is Ellsworth Kelly. He served in a camouflage unit during World War II as a young man. And so a lot of that camouflage training really informed his artwork. And it's a little bit of like a personal piece too, just thinking about a kind of queer sensibility between me and him. So anyway, that's the stuff I write about. And this is what I've been working on at Sitka, which I've been so thankful to come out here finally and really get to look at this piece. And so what I've been looking at is it's kind of like a comparative analysis between the flows of salmon and water along the Columbia River and then the flows of information moving through all of the data centers that are along the Columbia River, thinking about the data industry along the Columbia River as this kind of most recent chapter in the industrial history of that river, and just thinking about how in both of these systems we've kind of shifted from all these wild flows to this extremely technological, highly managed, highly dammed set of movements. And so these top images are sort of like the salmon and all of the things that they have to do to like live now. They're going through all of these fish bypass pipes and things. The hatcheries are really keeping them alive. So that's that middle top image. They're being surveilled at all times. They're being counted and tracked just to make sure that the health of the fisheries maintains itself. And so I'm beginning to think about how that kind of like highly managed and highly technologically modified lifestyle connects to our own as we think about, these big tech companies and the ways that they're sort of damming and constricting and redirecting the flows of our own connections online through algorithms and things like that. So that's very nascent. I'm still working through what that piece is going to be about. And it's been really such a joy to be able to actually come out here and get a sense of the power of these landscapes because I think it's really clarifying what the basis of this project is going to be. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I started reading Kirk's Substack after our interview last May, like religiously. I can't recommend it enough to everyone listening. Definitely do check that out. So thank you again, Kirk. Thank you, Epiphany, Fiona, Takahiro, Josephine, everyone for joining us tonight. We look forward to seeing you all at our next resident talk on February 24th. Good night, everyone.